Right, rook plus a and h pawn versus rook. To stand the best chance of understanding everything that's about to go on in this video, strongly recommend you watch the not the Vancouver defense video, and then you watch the Vancouver defense video, and that will make a lot of sense of what's going on with the moves that you're about to see. Basically, black wants to create the Vancouver defense here and stop the white rook from getting out in front of its pawn, and we're just going to ignore the h pawn. So the question, I suppose, is, does the Vancouver defense work if there's a sort of extra h pawn on the board? And the answer is yes. I mean, first of all, if the white pawn's on a7, we know that this h pawn does nothing. That h pawn does nothing. It's just going to run into a black king, which stays on h7. Similarly, if white had a g pawn, it does nothing. It would just run into a black king that is going to stay on g7. And the defensive technique would be just move your rook up and down the a file all day, and as soon as the white king makes contact with the pawn on a7, then you just start checking the hell out of the king, and there's just no way for white to make progress. That was not the Vancouver defense, and then in the Vancouver defense video, the a7 becomes shelter for the king, and it gets more complicated, and we have to see a lateral defense. Now, does this h pawn make any difference whatsoever to that lateral defense? And the answer is no. But there are other ways to draw this position. So if we ignored the h pawn, black has lots of drawing moves here. By far the simplest is check the king and attack that pawn laterally. And that also works here with the h pawn. Okay. But if we're ignoring the h pawn, another drawing method that black has here, well, loads of first moves but leading to the same plan. Rook a5, we might see a check from the rook and the king comes up. And then the white king comes across. Now, either rook b5 or rook c5 would draw the position here if white didn't have an h pawn. Although the black king might need to be on g6 by now, actually thinking about it, which it could have been if it wasn't for this h pawn. So ignoring the h pawn is including the black king being on g6 by now. What black would do is just bring their rook across. If white wants to make any progress other than just get into the standard Vancouver setup of lateral attack, which black's is threatening, white would have to get their rook out, basically. You come back behind the a pawn. Again, rook a7, we're going around in circles. So to make progress, white has to come and defend their a pawn. Or they suppose they could have pushed their a pawn to a7. But it's the same idea that once the skewer trick has gone, that's when the black king starts coming over. Okay, so we see both the kings come over. Rook goes back, and ignoring the h pawn, I think that's still a draw. Although it might be the black king's just one square too far away. The black king would be on d7 by now if it was allowed to have rested on g6 a minute ago. But I mean, it might be that the black king being on e7 has already made this not a draw. If ignoring the h pawn, but that wasn't ignoring the h pawn because that's the reason the black king's on e7 rather than d7. But a sort of a more important reason that, you know, even if that was a draw without the h pawn, it's definitely not a draw with the h pawn because white just pushes that h pawn. And in fact, the engine's been screaming at me for the last 4-5 moves. Push the h pawn. What are you bringing the king over for? You know, just push the h pawn. So yeah, the second defensive technique doesn't work. So does the Vancouver defense work if white has an extra h pawn? Yes, but it has to be the Vancouver defense. It has to be lateral attack of that pawn. The sort of the Romanovsky method, where you sort of threaten to do a lateral attack of that pawn, but effectively let the white rook out with all this business. That doesn't work this time because the king march across to a drawn position isn't a drawn position because white's got an h pawn where you've just moved your king away from, and your king's just sort of stuck in no man's land over here. This is massively winning for white. We can just push pawns, skewer things, and I mean there'll be all sorts of tactical shots as well to get those pawns promoted. So it has to be that. Now, what that actually means is in this original position, if you remember that drawing zone that Romanovsky came up with back in 1950, I tried to sort of investigate this a little bit. I thought it might be amusing to get a drawing zone for this particular setup. Like what difference does the H-pawn make to that drawing zone? And I sort of lost track of what I was doing it, but it wasn't much. You know, the H-pawn does cause enough problems that that the drawing zone is actually very, very limited. But this position is a draw. You know, if you're playing a defensive side against A and H pawns, try and get that lateral attack going as soon as you can. Ignore this pawn. Just ignore it. We're going to see some games where the defending side, as soon as they didn't ignore that pawn, that's when their troubles began. Let's look at some games then. So this is a position from... No, it's not. Sorry, that was the end position. This is a game from 1977. It is white to play. What should white do? You could pause the video if you wanted. You could also maybe guess what did white do that was a mistake and allowed black to defend. So this is a reasonably simple win for white. Something like rook c5. King comes forward to attack, and we're cutting the king off. Challenge the rook. King b3. Rook goes behind the h-pawn, and already we're defending our h-pawn laterally. We might see a check. King b4. Rook back. a4. And now that this rook is on the fourth rank, just defending those two pawns, the black king literally can't get to the rook to attack it. That rook can just stay on c4. I mean, obviously you can't get challenged because a swap of rooks and white's clearly winning. And all white needs to do is move their king over here. And then this king and this pawn are just going to quite happily sort of shuffle up the board together. I mean, it might get stuck in the corner at the end, and then, you know, a bit of messing around. But even at that stage, without the a pawn, it's still one, isn't it? King in front of the pawn with a 5-file cutoff. We could go and look at that video to how to win it, but there'll be easier ways to win it because there is an a pawn as well. So yeah, that's just a win. But in this 1977 game, white played a4, and black pounced rook f4. This is the Vancouver defense, lateral attack on the h-pawn, and this king is just going to sort of stay up here, maybe have to move to a7 at some point, but this pawn is irrelevant. It doesn't help white. When I say it doesn't help, there are more things to be careful of. Okay, it does protect squares. It might protect the b6 square in a minute. So although we're laterally attacking the h-pawn, there is just that little bit less space to work with, and black has to tread very, very carefully. Got a game coming up between Karpov and Yusupov back in 1991, and Yusupov played it perfectly. He did tread extremely carefully, and we'll see some examples of that here. So rook f4, king b3, king a6. I guess we're sort of just doing the Vancouver setup, pretending there's not an 8th rank. Or even possibly pretending there's not a 7th rank here. a5, and just black just kept laterally attacking that h4 pawn. White king comes over, only way to make progress. Rook to c4, good move, that's where it belongs. King f3. Now, there isn't actually a place for the black rook. This is where there's a little bit less space. You have to be that little bit more careful. Because if it wasn't for this pawn, remember, the black king would already be here, and it's where it would be protecting these squares, so that when the barrage of checks comes in a minute, it's fine. Black would have just that bit more space to work with. So white very sensibly, now that this king is coming to the defense of the h-pawn, just started delivering checks. Rook c3 check is an excellent move. King e4, rook c4 check. And the king came towards the rook, so the rook went over here. There's a bit of space over there. It's fine to use the g file or the g4 square when the white king's all the way over on the d file. But just to just to give a sample of how black has to tread extremely carefully here. Like, there isn't a square on the 4th rank. King A7, by the way, a little waiting move is also fine. But there isn't a square on the 4th rank of the chessboard where the black rook could move to. If the rook goes to B4, this square's protected, and that's a problem. Okay, white could just play rook H8, king back to A7. H-pawn gets pushed. I think, all right, I'll attack that laterally. H-pawn gets pushed. Oh. I can't attack that laterally. So there's nothing that then black can do. If they come behind the pawn, remember, that's no good. The king approaches, and then they've got the shelter there on H7. The Vancouver defense can't continue there. So the B file was a problem. So the A5 pawn wasn't completely irrelevant from that point of view. And I don't know, rook takes A5 and king G4, and it's just gone. So the black rook can't go to the B file. And then what about the D file? You'd think that would be harmless enough. But actually it's too close to the white king, and it runs out of space. And it's quite subtle to see how it runs out of space. Rook H8, king A7, white pushes the H-pawn. So if you're black, you're thinking, all right, lateral defense. Rook D5. White plays king G4. They've now made contact with the H-pawn, and that means that the checks need to start. Rook D4, king F5, another check. King back to G6, contact with the H-pawn. The checks need to carry on. Rook D6. And then they go to this F7 square, which is extremely annoying, and then you might realise as black you are now stuck. If you go with, they're not in contact with their pawn, so I'll do a lateral attack, white can just push the H-pawn. You think, all right, I'll attack it laterally. You can't release your rook. White says, yes, I can, because you can't now come behind that pawn because I can attack your rook as I make contact with my H7 pawn. Oh. So I can't play rook D5 in this position. No, you can't. You run out of space. What about rook D7 check then? Just carry on with the checks. Well, now I'll come and attack you here. And you can't carry on with the lateral attacking of the H-pawn. So all the way back in this position, the extra A-pawn and the fact that it's sort of, the black king isn't on B6, and you have got just that little bit less space to play with, which is why it's very sensible. The C file, by the way, is a great file to be on. So if you get the chance to stay on it, do stay on it. And it's only when the kings come all the way over to the D file would you want to rest on G4. So rook c3 check. I mean, black played this perfectly, to be honest. Rook c4 check, king d5, over to g4, king e6, back to c4. The rook went to h8. All right, we'll sit the king on b7, rook h7 check, back to a6. And the players actually agreed to draw there. So very well played to the player with the black pieces in that 1977 game. You'd think that was winning, and it is winning. White played a4, and that was it. Their win was gone. With lots of chances to mess it up, black executed a perfect Vancouver defense on the H-pawn, basically. Right, next. This is a game from 1991. It's actually Karpov versus Yusupov. Black to play. And we've already got the lateral attack of the H-pawn. It's pretty similar to the last position, to be honest. But again, Yusupov played it perfectly. Rook c5, Karpov went rook h8, just gave up the a-pawn if black wanted it. Although I think king takes a6 would lose. Yes, it would. So what would you do here as black? Black has only 2 drawing moves. See if you can work out what they are. Now this rook's on this rank, you really don't want to bring your king forward, because that means that when this h-pawn advances, you're going to have to use at least one move to get your king back to b7, and that's going to be trouble. Just as a general rule in these defences, leave the irrelevant pawn alone. Like, it's irrelevant. leave it alone. If you want to prove a pawn is irrelevant, you need to leave it alone. Well, I guess maybe if you checked, I suppose there's no harm in taking it. Any rook move along this file, sorry, not nearly any rook move along this rank, sorry, is going to lose. There's the four rook moves along that file rank. Sorry, oh no, there's loads. There's rook f. Sorry, I'm losing the ability to count here. So there's loads of moves for the rook along that rank. These two are sort of obviously bad, but moves that you might not think are bad are things like rook b5 and rook d5. Rook b5 and rook d5 are both losing moves. You could do what the guy in that last game did, which is a very sensible idea, and just immediately stay on the c file. Just check the white king until it gets over to the d file. In fact, that would pretty much follow exactly what we saw in the previous game. Yusupov played rook g5, which is the only rook move along the 5th rank which still draws. It stops the white king coming into g4. Karpov played king e4, and then Yusupov played rook back to c5. And it was a perfectly executed defence. But just it's probably a bit of a repeat here, but just to sort of go through some problems. There's your problem with rook b5. You've just made the a pawn, you've just made the irrelevant a pawn slightly relevant, and we see king g4. Oh dear, contact with a pawn. Checks need to start. There you go. Keep checking. Oh, I can't check. Okay, problem, and then white's going to win that. Rook d5. Not enough space. Too close to the white king. It's a bit weird, isn't it? It's too close to the white king and the king goes that way. Makes contact with the pawn. Checks need to start. There you go. Check. Make contact with the pawn. Checks need to carry on. King f7. And we're in the same dilemma as before, really. If we want to carry on with that lateral defence, we would see h6. I mean, black's got a couple of choices here. Either check and then the rook gets hit, or you think, oh, I'll carry on with the lateral defence. Rook d6. But then we've got h7, rook h6, and the king can attack the rook at the same time as making contact with the h-pawn. And then in the rook d7 check line, king makes contact with the rook, rook back to c7. And there's a few winning moves for white here, but a very simple one is rook d8. Okay, because now the rook can't go to h7, because that's a rook swap. This rook check doesn't do anything because of the block. And we've got the rook out from behind the pawn. In fact, rook d7 is a pretty nasty threat that I can't see black getting out of there. So yeah, rook b5 loses in this position, rook d5 loses in this position, but Yusupov played it flawlessly with rook g5. King e4, rook back to c5, king f4, rook c4 check, king e5, rook c5 check, and now there is just enough space. You can hopefully see how the c file was very good for the rook. Rook h7, now the pawn's taken, why not? h6, rook c7 check, and they agree to draw there, because it's pretty obvious that Yusupov knew what he was doing at that point, and now we have the Vancouver defence even without the irrelevant a-pawn. So yeah, both those last two games show that the lateral attack of the pawn with the rook stuck in front of it is good, but you've got to be really careful with the lack of space, and if in doubt, keep the checks going with your rook on the c file. It's probably not a bad idea. Okay, I wouldn't go as far to say that you couldn't contrive a circumstance where it wasn't the right idea for some reason, but it looks to me like it's always the right thing to do. Right, last. I say last. This is a position that has occurred, exactly the same position has occurred in two different games. It is, one of them was from 1970, the other one was from 1993. It's white to play. Pause the video and decide what move would you play next as white, and maybe just what's your more general defensive plan. So yeah, I mean, a general defensive plan here should really be just to sort of mimic what Yusupov did in that game, and just maintain your lateral attack of that A pawn, being very careful of which squares on that fifth rank to use, given the limited space. So rook b5. Well done if you played rook b5 with a plan that when the black king comes over, you come back and stay on the f file, just like staying on the c file in those previous games. King c6, and then start the checks. If the black king goes back, lateral attack on that pawn. If the king comes over to the e file, then we would go over to the b file. So we can just sort of switch back and forth between the b and the f file. Now, in both the games from 1970 and 1993, top players basically didn't know that defensive system, and it went pear-shaped for them. So the first one, which was 1970, the player with the white pieces played king g2. Black goes king d6, king f2, rook a2 check. What would you do here as white? It's not been lost yet. White still has just, well, 2 drawing moves here, actually. But yeah, where would you go with your king from here? Any king move up to the 3rd rank is lost because of h3. That pawn can't be taken because a rook swap would follow, and the a pawn can't be stopped by a white king on h3. King e4 maybe, h2. This rook, which remember is meant to be sort of laterally defending, attacking that pawn, is now earmarked for that. There's going to be all sorts of trouble there, isn't there? There's probably a deflection tactic on the way, but black's got this extra pawn as well, and yeah, that's just clearly over. So you can't move your king up to the 3rd rank. In the game, king e1 was played. That's a losing move, but it's not too late to go king g1 and still try and get that lateral attack. You're just ignoring the h-pawn. Just completely ignore it. Just you want your king in this part of the board, so king g1 was still a drawing move. In the game, king e1 was played. King f1, by the way, was also close enough to the corner. That was the other drawing move. But yeah, king e1 was played in the game. Rook a1 check. And I mean, various options for white here. In the game, king e2 was played. a4, we saw a check. King there, another check. And the black king just comes over to the rook. This is what actually happened in the game, king g2. Rook c1. I mean, the black rook is out from being in front of the pawn. I mean, the white resigned there. We've got the lateral defense, which is all we need. If it wasn't for the h-pawn, the lateral defense comes down to whether these, it's a race between the 2 kings to get over. But with the h-pawn, that race is irrelevant. Let's go back to the bit where there were some choices after rook a1 check. If king tries to go this way, the a-pawn gets pushed. We might see rook takes h4. And the white rook is just sort of clumsily placed. The lateral defense can't continue. And after rook a3, the white king wasn't close enough to the corner. There's the skewer idea. And finally, if the king comes this way, king e2 was like a choice, really, but a compromise. But if the white king had come this way, we can go rook h1 straight away. And if the rook takes, we've got h3. And after rook h5, the white king is in no man's land. Okay, I think black can pretty much pre-move this. Not literally, because rook takes h2, of course, but rook a1 is, the skewer idea is going to work that way. So yeah, that game went king g2. Yeah, actually, did I go through the whole game? I think I did go through the whole game, and it just ended reasonably soon like this. Yeah, white resigned there. So what white should have done was, I suppose it was 1970, so they wouldn't have seen Yusupov defend it perfectly in 1991, but they should have copied his method, basically, which he executed perfectly, just alternating between the B files and the F files and delivering checks as soon as that black king gets over to the pawn. Come back, pawns in the crosshairs, Dvoretsky calls it. But exactly the same position was reached in a 1993 game, and to be honest, I mean that they probably should have seen that Yusupov game if they're sort of top chess players, and that was a game from Linares or one of the top tournaments or something, wasn't it? If it was Karpov versus Yusupov. So yeah, the play with the white pieces in this game went rook h6 check, which is all right. I mean, it's still not thrown away the draw yet. King d5, rook h5 check, king c4, and this is where they went wrong. Okay, so in the game, rook takes h4 check was played. White took the irrelevant pawn, and it's now just too late to to get the desired result. King b3. The white rook is sort of getting in. The white king, sorry, is getting in the way of its rook. The white rook is very awkwardly placed on the h file. What white should have done, so I'll come back to that in a sec because it's not finished. There's quite a lot of complicated stuff going on. But what white should have done here after king c4, it wasn't too late to still execute the Vankura defense. Okay, rook f5. If rook a1, king back to h2, a4, and the checks begin with the always needing to use the b4 square if the king, or the b file if the king ever arrives over on the e file. So yeah, let's get back to the game then, because there's still some more to be discussed there. It's sort of instructive to see how it went wrong after taking that pawn. King b3, rook h5, and now white went wrong. Black went wrong, sorry. Black's got two winning moves here, one of which is to sort of repeat the position we just had. So, you know, king b4 and then sort of go around in circles and then have another chance to get here and find the winning move. It's pretty subtle. The idea is that we want to keep the rook on the h file where it is misplaced, because its king's in the way, and if the king comes this way, the king is going to get in the way of at least one of those lateral attacks that you're going to get from the Vankura system. And the way to achieve that is very clever, is rook a3. And the idea is that if white tries to come off the h file, then that's king moves with check. We defend the pawn, but with check. So when the king moves, our rook's out from in front of the pawn. We might see the rook coming behind. It looks pretty over to me. The engine's already on minus 35. Well, it keeps changing its mind from my... It's weird what the engine's doing here. But this is clearly gone. Yeah, you can see that that's gone. So that was a clever little move that could have been played. There's also, I mean, white doesn't have to play rook g5, but then black's, it's like mission accomplished. So if we saw, I don't know, king h2, the white rook, like I say, is awkwardly placed on that h file. Rook down to a2, almost a repeat of the same thing. Yeah, I mean, it is a repeat of the same thing. We could see king h1, check, a pawn advances, white's dead, or we could have seen an attempt to get the rook off the h file again with the check, make contact with the pawn, rook c2, and it's gone. So yeah, rook a3, very, very clever little move there. In the game, white played rook a1. And after king g2, push the pawn. And yeah, you can see that white's in real trouble here, because their king's in the way of the checks. They kind of want their rook on f5, don't they? In fact, if their rook was on f5, it would be a draw. We'd just start the barrage of checks and execute the Vankura defense. So, I mean, if white tries that check, rook h3, the king hides on b2 straight away, rook h4, and we push the a pawn. Okay. If instead white plays king f2, which I'm trying to struggle to see what actually happened in the game now, because I haven't got it in my bold text because there are two games from the same position. So I think it was this that happened in the game. a3, rook b5 check. King A2, King E2, Rook B1, and yeah, you can see that this is sort of big trouble for White now. I think it ended Rook D8, A2, and then yeah, White resigned there. Was there anything else to say after Rook A1? Ah yes, the thing to say after Rook A1 is that it allowed the White Rook off the H file. So the Rook A1 actually throws away the win because White should have played Rook G5. And yeah, we've got the Vancouver defense. I've put a few more moves in here, I'm not sure why. Oh yes, wanted to demonstrate that you've got to keep going with the checks here. Rook G6 check. Just keep going with the checks until the black king's sort of far enough over, because your king wasn't in the right place, so you need to get your king to G2. And yeah, I mean, in this position, if Rook B1, we come behind the pawn, Rook B4, and we're okay with the king race over there. And if instead of Rook B1, A3, we've got the Vancouver set up, Rook G3. If you were a bit hasty in that position a second ago, because a lot of lines, isn't there? It's very, very complicated, this stuff. If you're a bit hasty here and didn't keep going with the checks, but instead tried to execute this Rook G4 immediately, that would be fine if your king was on H2. But you're sort of one move too slow. A3, now you've got to waste a move with King H2, and that gives black time to get their rook out from in front of the pawn. If you don't waste that move with King H2, Rook G3, then we'll see A2, and black's threatening, check, and promoting. And yeah, you can't do anything. You need to play Rook A3 and King H2 or King G2 on the same move. And of course, you only get one move in chess each go rather than two. I think I've covered everything. Apologies if you're sort of now shouting at your screen. It's like, oh, you never went back and did that variation. But yeah, sorry if I've sort of missed one of the side variations in one of those two games. But we have two games, one from 1970, one from 1993, where two very strong players, way stronger than I'll ever be, neither of which knew the Vancouver drawing method, which could have been executed here. You know, Rook B5, King D6, Rook back to F5, just as you saw Yusupov doing that game against Karpov. And yeah, the F file is definitely a great file to stay on. I back myself to draw this position if I ever end up defending A and H pawns, rook and A and H pawns versus rook. I back myself to draw this position. And like I say, I will never get to the standard of those two players that messed it up. But, you know, on this position, we know what's going to happen now. Next chess game I play, I'll get this position and completely mess it up. Right, I'd like to finish with a little challenge for you all, which I'm not going to give the answer to, as an interesting thing for you to work out. So this is a position with white to play. White's winning this position, even though we've already got the Vancouver. I mean, that's about as good as it's going to get for black, right? Their king's on G7, and they're attacking this pawn laterally, which is what they should be doing. Okay, if white plays A7, this is a trivial draw. Okay, Rook A6, and black's plan, remember from not the Vancouver defense video, is to stay on the A file until the king reaches B6, and then you just check the hell out of the white king until it comes down the board, and then you just stay on the A file again. That is a very easy draw. If white has a G pawn, which white does, it is irrelevant because it's just going to run into that king. If white had an H pawn, it would be irrelevant. because it would just run into a king that you would just put on h7 and do exactly the same drawing system. Okay, let's go back to the original position. We know, because we've just done a whole video on it and seen lots of games where players have executed it perfectly, that if this g-pawn was on h2, we can just do the Vancouver defence, being very careful with the amount of space, and we'd be going between the B and the F files, wouldn't we, at some point as the white king gets closer. We know that's a draw. Okay, so your challenge is to work out why, if white hasn't pushed their A pawn, why is a G pawn on the board? Why is this position winning for white? What's the extra maneuver that white has with a G pawn that they didn't have with the H pawn? With the same sort of ID, and this G pawn's irrelevant. It's just going to run into this king, and I can just execute this Vancouver defense. So why is that the case? Challenge for you to think about.